And I would mention this to my mom, and she would say, "Oh, you're just overthinking a bunch of things."
Awekenge, this is Mental Mythos, hosted by Asago Toto.
Something that people don't actually look at and don't realize that they have an addiction, whereas in a sense of it's seen as a coping mechanism in a way. Probably through our conversation, the audience will learn something from our conversation and be able to just see where they can better themselves in general and how they could take care of themselves. So with those words, I would like to say thank you for joining us today and welcoming to Mental Matters. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate your time today and looking forward to our conversation.
And as I said, that I want to touch on addiction and your addiction recovery, and also that I saw that you had bipolar disorder. In terms of addiction, I believe that those two things don't actually mix in a way, because in some way they could make it worse when it comes to bipolar. It's a disorder that is seen as, I would say that they meet in a way, as much as there's advocacy about bipolar disorder, there's this stigma around it that it's a bad thing and people with bipolar are crazy. And as I've said, through our conversation, the audience will learn something. To start, can you start by telling us a bit about your early life and what initially led you to struggle with the addiction?
Sure. Well, I grew up not really realizing that anything was necessarily wrong with me. It was just, I tend to, in my bipolar phases, I tend to be in an up and not depressed mood quite a lot. So it didn't present that often, but occasionally I would get very, very sad for 2 or 3 days and be unable to adapt or adjust to situations. And things were very difficult for me. If I didn't achieve something that I felt I could, it would hit me harder than most people. So it was kind of hidden. And it wasn't until I was late in my teen years, 16 or 17, that it really became apparent. I would go into manic episodes where I would be up for 3 or 4 days. And I would mention this to my mom, and she would say, "Oh, you're just overthinking a bunch of things. It'll be okay," and so that it wasn't really looked at as I had any issue. So it wasn't until I got to college that I was actually diagnosed as bipolar. But I didn't want to believe that I was bipolar because I had grown up in a household that told me there's nothing wrong with you. So I discarded the diagnosis, and instead I started using alcohol to tamp down my manic episodes so I could interact with people whenever I was in a mania, which isn't healthy. And then over time, it just became something that I could not quit. Just like ratchet that up over time in terms of more and more alcohol was necessary in order to deal with it. And then I became an alcoholic. I couldn't live without the alcohol. And the bipolar was just kind of secondary to the challenges I was facing with addiction at that point.
And your story, and I love the fact that people have different perspective when it comes to the conversation of addiction. I guess I think it was last month, whereas she works at an addiction facility where they assist people dealing with addiction, where she said that an addiction is a symptom of something. And really, the story that you just gave me, the same thing that for you saw it, as I mentioned earlier, that you saw it as an escape, as a coping mechanism. And this, as mental health, that it's something that is new to people's minds, and also it's something that we are trying by any means to normalize. Back then, how did you felt when you received that diagnosis? As much as you had that love from your family that they told you that you don't have anything wrong with you, what did you think that those manic episodes meant to you?
Well, I tell you, it made me feel like I was defective, quite frankly, and that's not a good thing. And you're right that the acceptance of mental health challenges has come a long way since that diagnosis 30 years ago. And so it's definitely something today that probably would be looked at differently, even from a doctor perspective. Even doctors at that point, mental health just was kind of swept under the rug in a sense. It's the way that you felt as a patient anyway. The other big challenge that I had is that the prescription medication for bipolar disorder can be very cramping on your ability to feel like yourself. And it really, the best way I can describe it is it puts a cap on your ability to think. So if you're a creative person like I am, I lost my ability to have any creative thinking. But if I used alcohol to tame it, then I could still think creatively, but I didn't feel so manic. And I find in my work now, being sober for so many years, is that other people have had the same challenges when they have this comorbidity of addiction and bipolar disorder. They're searching for something that achieves the result of not feeling the symptoms of bipolar disorder. At the same time, they don't want to lose themselves. And when you feel like a robot, I mean, when you don't feel like yourself, you don't want to continue taking medication. And you just don't. I think that everyone strives to feel what they would define as their norm. And it's taken me a long time and a lot of effort to find a way to manage all of those challenges through mindfulness and reflective thought and basically rewiring my brain so that I can live a sober life without medication.
And something that's quite interesting, the way you spoke about creativity, and one thing that I've seen in terms of, if you take a look back and see the most successful people within the industry of creativeness, you will find that they have this thing of interlinking their creativity with their mental illnesses. And it's quite something. I think I had a guest on a podcast where she said that her mental illness was her superpower. And I feel like at some point, I also felt that way because I did have dealing with some mental health issues and I couldn't be normal. I didn't know how to cope. And through my coping, I decided to pick a pen and a paper and just write. In terms of outlet was poetry, like just writing and writing and writing, knowing that it made me feel better in a way. But one thing that my perspective really changed when I started this podcast and allowed myself to just explore other ways of, I would say, coping mechanism, trying to, as you mentioned, mindfulness and reflecting. Speaking about reflecting, when you were still out, before we get into that, as individuals, there's this thing about addiction that when you have an addiction and you do that addiction, at the end of the day, you have that shame that you've done this. So what was your initial, I would say, turning point that you needed to be sober? You needed to better yourself. You needed to take care of yourself.
Well, it started, I mean, it's kind of an interesting crash to the bottom that I had. Even though I was, by all accounts, an addict, at some point in here, about 10 years, or maybe more like 10 years into the drinking, I started doing drugs as well. I basically used cocaine as my antidepressant and alcohol as my mania suppressant, if that makes any sense. So I ended up with this dual addiction, and in which I would balance the two out, where I would drink alcohol for days when I was really manic. And then if I got depressed, I would use cocaine to offset the fact that I was depressed. But I was successful by all, outward signs. I was a business owner, honestly had no idea that I was in such dire psychological straits. And as a matter of fact, when I wrote my first book, there were several people who had known me for 15, 20 years that read my book and said, I had no idea. I wish I would have known. I would have tried to help. And so that showed me just how much I managed to disguise it, which is amazing. So in 2014, I randomly met a girl on a beach in Florida, Samantha Thomas, and she was really interested in my bipolar challenges and wanted to find a way basically to work through those bipolar challenges and with getting rid of the drugs and alcohol. And so this was really interesting. We drew, really close, and she really became my person. And about a year after we met, I got to a point where addiction just completely overtook me, and I lost my business, my house, and I ended up living on the street. And during that time period, I didn't have a phone a lot of times, and she'd write me letters, and that's how we corresponded. She was halfway across the country. And that's when I really started doing the deep reflective as she guided me along the way. And in 2016, March 23rd of 2016 is my sober date. That was my first day sober. And that really was the new beginning. But I got there because I had lost everything. And I was basically up against a wall, forced into really looking at myself and saying, what are you doing? What can you do to improve yourself? And then I just turned myself into my own self-improvement project with Samantha's guidance. And so I ended up creating my own method because AA just really didn't work for me. NA didn't work. It just didn't work for me. And then on August 1st of 2020, Samantha was murdered by a drunk driver. That really threw everything back into focus for me, that I needed to do something to share my success with others and what had worked for me. And so that's how I got to the work that I'm doing today in sobriety, was really from being motivated by her tragic loss.
Such heartbreaking story, and being able to stay there. And I believe that when someone motivates us to have that recovery, to push us in that sense of trying to be better, trying to be in the states of, I want to be better, I want to share my message. I believe that someone does that to you became, in a way of, I would say, that's something that really enlightened you to share your story, to be able to help others to be better themselves, because addiction is not a light conversation. It's a conversation that people are running away from. And when you confront a person with an addiction, it becomes like, it's like you are fighting them, whereas you're trying by any means to understand why are they doing what they are doing. So I applaud you for just sharing that part of you. And it's not of being sober. At some point in our lives that we can try by any means to be sober. Definitely there will be challenges within that road of being sober, because something that is worth it, there are about to be challenges. Did you ever come across in terms of relapsing, in terms of going back to the drugs, going back to the alcohol?
No, I haven't since that date, but I will tell you at the very end, that last, and I share this a lot with people because messing up is just part of that final push to understand that it's really important. In the last couple of months that after I'd gone to rehab and I got out and I had been sober for like 5 weeks, and then I had a relapse, and then I came out and I was sober for another like week, and then I relapsed again, and it was painful. That was some of the most painful experiences of my life, because anyone who has actually been addicted and gone through relapse and then come out and been sober again knows exactly what I'm talking about. It is a painful experience, especially alcohol, and opioids are also very painful to the body. And quite frankly, it was just one of these things where I'm like, I'm going to either end up dead or I need to just stop right now. And that's really what it came to. That final time, I was like, you know what? I can't do this anymore, or else I'm just going to be dead. And I don't want to be dead. That's what it was.
You get to a point that that isn't an option per se, because you find that as much as you feel this pain, as you mentioned that you had come across in terms of trying to escape the manic episode, and definitely it must have been hard for you. And I just want to try this conversation on a movie that I once watched. I think I did watch it back in 2020. Actually, yes, 2020 when I started this podcast. And I found it so profoundly. I'm not quite sure if you are aware of it. Touched by Fire.
No, I have not seen it.
It's about these two patients that both have the bipolar disorder, and also apparently both of them have the maniac episodes and the depressive episodes. And where it goes, actually, to summarize the whole movie, it really talks about how bipolar people are seen and how they act. And definitely there are beauties and there are horrors. What kind of horrors did you come across as within your journey, and also adding addiction, which is drugs? And I believe that drugs are worse. So What kinds of horrors did you come across?
Well, I mean, it's I'm glad that I can't remember